There's a moment you probably remember, not because it was loud, because it was quiet in a way that felt wrong. Maybe you said something real, something that cost you something to say, and the person across from you looked at you for half a second, then turned the conversation back to themselves. Not rudely, not obviously, just smoothly, the way water finds a lower path without announcing it. And you sat there holding the thing you just offered, and you thought maybe it didn't matter. Maybe you were being too sensitive. Maybe you imagined the slight. You didn't imagine it. That moment, that specific quiet erasure, is where a lot of people first begin to understand something that takes years to fully name. It happens at dinner tables, it happens in bedrooms, it happens in offices where someone who calls themselves your mentor somehow makes every conversation about their legacy, their vision, their sacrifices. You leave those rooms feeling smaller than when you walked in, and you can never quite explain why, because nothing obviously terrible happened. That's the thing about narcissism. It doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it looks like love. You know this person, or you've known them. Maybe you love them. Maybe you still do, and that's the part that makes this hard to sit with. Think about how it felt to be around them in the beginning. There was something magnetic about their certainty. They moved through the world like they'd already decided it belonged to them, and for a while, being close to that felt like warmth, like safety, like finally being chosen by someone who seemed to choose very carefully. They made you feel seen in those early days. Extraordinary, even. They remembered the small details, what you ordered, what you feared, what you dreamed about, and you thought, this person really knows me. This person really sees me. But slowly, you started to notice a pattern. When you were hurting, the conversation would shift. When you had a success, there was always a subtle qualifier. When you needed something, there was a cost, not spoken aloud, but felt. And when you pulled back, even slightly, the warmth disappeared so completely that you scrambled to bring it back, not because you wanted to, but because you'd forgotten what you felt like without it. You started monitoring yourself, measuring your words, asking yourself before you spoke, will this make them feel threatened? Will this start something? You became fluent in a language of caution around someone who was supposed to be safe. That's not love, but it can feel like it for a long time. Let's slow down here and look at what's actually happening underneath the surface, because what most people understand about narcissism is the loudest version. The braggart, the person who talks about themselves at every party, the one who posts the most, performs the most, demands the most obvious attention. But the psychology is quieter and stranger than that. What researchers and clinicians have spent decades observing is this. At the center of what we call narcissistic personality structure is not actually an excess of self-love. It is a profound, almost bottomless deficit of it. There is a self-image built entirely on external reflection, the way a mirror can only show you what's in front of it, nothing more, nothing less. Take away the reflection, and the image disappears. This is what psychologists call fragile high self-esteem. On the surface, the grandiosity, the entitlement, the effortless self-promotion, all of it reads as confidence, and in some moments it genuinely functions like confidence. But underneath that performance is something that cannot tolerate being questioned, because being questioned feels, to that person, like being erased. There's a concept called narcissistic injury. It sounds dramatic, but it describes something very ordinary. It's what happens when someone whose entire sense of self depends on being seen a certain way encounters anything that contradicts that image. A criticism, a comparison, being overlooked in a room, someone else receiving praise. These are not neutral events for a person built this way. They register as threats, sometimes as attacks, even when no attack was intended. And here's the part that tends to get lost in every conversation about narcissism. Most of the behaviors that hurt you were not premeditated cruelty. They were survival. Unconscious, deeply patterned survival responses from someone who learned, usually very early, that the only way to stay safe was to control how they were perceived, and that something in their original environment, a parent, a loss, a humiliation they could not metabolize, convinced them that their real self was not enough. That doesn't make the harm they caused you smaller, it just makes the story more true. Here's where it gets complicated. Here's the layer most people don't reach because it requires sitting with something uncomfortable. The reason narcissistic relationships are so specifically painful isn't just the behavior, it's what the behavior does to your relationship with yourself. Over time, if you spend enough years in close proximity to someone who cannot truly see you, you begin to stop trusting your own perception. This is not an accident, it's a consequence. When someone consistently reframes your reality, when your anger is called oversensitivity, when your needs are called demands, when your sadness is called manipulation, you don't just stop expressing those things, you start to genuinely wonder if they're real. Psychologists call this epistemic cowardice, when it's the speaker's choice. But when it's done to you repeatedly, when someone else consistently undermines your right to interpret your own experience, it creates something closer to what researchers describe as self-silencing. You learn that your inner world is not welcome here, so you begin to edit it before it even reaches the surface. And then something even stranger happens. Because human beings are meaning-making creatures, and we will almost always find a way to explain our own suffering that feels more bearable than the full truth, you may have started to believe that the problem was you. That if you were more patient, more understanding, more skilled at managing this person's needs, things would be different. You became a student of their moods, a reader of their silences, an expert in their emotional weather systems. That expertise costs something. It costs you the same attention you gave so freely to them. There's a term for what happens in long-term relationships with narcissistic individuals: trauma bonding. It's not weakness, it's neurology. It's the way intermittent reinforcement, moments of warmth followed by withdrawal, creates a biochemical attachment that's harder to break than simple love. The uncertainty itself becomes the hook. You stay not just because of who they are when they're good, but because your nervous system has been trained to find the return of their warmth as relief, as reward, as proof that you are, after all, worth something to them. What saved you then imprisons you now. Take a breath here, just a breath. Because this is where we arrive at the part of the conversation that is the quietest and the most important. You may have loved this person genuinely, and that love may have been real even when everything around it was distorted. That's not something to be ashamed of. Love doesn't require perfect conditions to be authentic. And sometimes we love people not because they are good to us, but because some part of us recognizes something in them that we have never been able to put into words. Here is the most honest sentence of everything you're going to hear today. Some of us were drawn to narcissistic people not because we were naive, but because we were prepared. Because we grew up in rooms where we learned to earn our place, where love felt like a performance review, where we were praised for what we produced and looked through when we needed something. We already knew the language, we were already fluent in it, and when we met someone who spoke it, something in us recognized it as home, even as it was breaking us. That's the truth that takes the longest to look at directly. Not that you were manipulated by a stranger, but that you were drawn toward a familiar pain, because unfamiliar safety can feel more frightening than familiar hurt. For so long, I thought I was the problem, and the saddest part is, that thought kept me close to them. So what do you do with that? Not as a command, not as a homework assignment, just as an honest question. What do you do with the understanding that the pattern goes deeper than one person, than one relationship, than the narcissist you're currently processing? This is where the work becomes yours. Not because they aren't responsible for what they did. They are. But because you cannot change what happened, and you cannot change them, and what you are left holding is your own life, your own interior world, and the question of what you want to build inside it going forward. There's a concept in depth psychology called shadow work. It's one of those terms that sounds heavier than it is. All it really means is this: there are parts of you that you learn to hide, not because they were bad, but because they were unwelcome in the environments where you needed to survive. Your anger maybe, your needs, your grief, your pride, Whatever it was that someone important to you treated as a liability, you put it away. You became smaller to fit, and the shadow is simply what you put away. The invitation, and it is only an invitation, not a prescription, is to begin getting curious about what you put away, not to drag it out violently, not to perform your healing for anyone, but to sit quietly with the parts of yourself you were taught to distrust and ask them what they needed and what they still need. Some of us need to learn how to let someone be wrong about us without needing to correct them. Some need to learn that saying no is a sentence, not a negotiation. Some need to learn that love that costs you your sense of self is not love. It is a transaction, and you are allowed to leave transactions that don't serve you. I'm learning that I don't have to earn the right to take up space. There's also the question of the inner child, a phrase that gets used so often it can start to feel hollow, but which points to something genuinely true. Somewhere in you there is the version of you that first learned these patterns. The child who learned to read the room before they read a book, who learned to manage another person's feelings before they learned to manage their own, who became the caretaker, the peacemaker, the one who made themselves smaller so someone else could feel bigger. That child was not wrong to do what they did. That child was brilliant at surviving. The question is only whether that child's strategies are still serving the adult you've become. Here's something worth sitting with as this moves toward a close. Narcissism, as a pattern, as a wound, is not confined to the people who hurt you. It lives in culture. It lives in systems that reward performance and punish vulnerability. It lives in social media ecosystems designed to make everyone curate a self that performs better than it feels. It lives in families, in generational lines of people who never learned to hold their own pain, so they handed it downward, quietly, through expectation and withholding, and the specific coldness of conditional love. What this means is that the person who hurt you was also, somewhere, hurt, not as an excuse, as a context, because context doesn't excuse behavior, but it can release you from the exhausting project of making their damage mean something about your worth. They weren't unable to see you because you weren't worth seeing. They were unable to see you because they couldn't see themselves clearly either. The mirror was already broken before you arrived, and you spent years trying to be a better reflection for someone who couldn't actually look. I was never the problem. I was just the mirror they kept asking to show something it couldn't. So where does this leave you? Not cured, not finished, not standing at the summit with perfect clarity and a clean heart. That's not what this is. That's not what healing ever actually is. What it might leave you with is something smaller and more durable than a resolution. It might leave you with a thread, just a thread. The beginning of a new kind of attention you turn toward yourself, not the hyper-vigilant attention you learn to give to someone else's moods, but a softer, more patient attention. The kind that asks gently, what do I actually feel right now, and what do I actually need? And does this person in front of me have the capacity to meet me? Or am I already translating myself into a language they can understand while losing something essential in the process? You're allowed to ask those questions. You're allowed to let the answers mean something. You're allowed to be in a room with someone and feel, for no articulable reason, a shrinking feeling in your chest, and to trust that feeling even before you can explain it. You were once good at reading other people's weather. You're allowed to turn some of that skill toward your own sky. The relationships that are worth what you bring to them will not require you to edit yourself before you speak. They will not make you feel like the difficult one for having needs that are, by any honest measure, ordinary. They will not punish you for the days you aren't performing well. They will just be there, slightly imperfect, genuinely trying, and that, it turns out, is what ordinary love actually looks like when it's not wrapped in the extraordinary performance of someone who needs you to need them. I used to mistake intensity for intimacy. Now I'm learning what quiet love sounds like. There will still be hard days. Days when you miss them, not the reality of them, but the version of them that existed in the best moments, the version you held on to through all the worst ones. Grief for a narcissistic relationship is complicated precisely because you're grieving something that was never fully real, and that kind of grief has no clean name and no expected timeline. Let it be that complicated. Don't rush it into a lesson. There will be days when old patterns surface, when you catch yourself shrinking, managing, over-explaining, preemptively apologizing. When you notice yourself doing those things, the instinct might be to feel shame about it. But shame is not useful here. Curiosity is. Just notice. Just say quietly inside yourself, "There it is. That's the old pattern." And then ask, gently, whether you need it right now, in this moment, with this person. Some days you will. Old patterns don't leave all at once. They thin, slowly, like fog burning off in the morning. Not dramatically, just gradually, until one day you're standing somewhere and you realize you've been speaking for 10 minutes without once wondering whether you were too much. That day is coming. Not because you've fixed yourself, because you don't need fixing, but because you've started to learn the difference between relationships that diminish you and relationships that have enough room for all of you. And once you know the difference, you cannot unknow it. Think back to that opening moment. The dinner table, the office, the bedroom, the thing you said that cost something to say, the silence that followed, the way you reached back in and took it quietly before anyone noticed you'd offered it. That offering was not foolish. That reaching toward another person was not naivety. It was human. It was, in fact, one of the most human things you can do. The capacity to be vulnerable, to reach across the space between two people and say, "Here, this is real. This is me." That capacity is not a flaw in you. It was never the flaw. The flaw was only ever in the receiving. You still have that capacity. It's still in you. And the question that lives quietly at the end of all of this is not whether you should close yourself off, learn not to reach, build something impenetrable and finally safe. The question is only whether you'll learn slowly and without cruelty toward yourself to offer that reaching to people who know how to hold it. Not everyone will, but some will, and the ones who do won't require a performance from you. They won't need you to be extraordinary. They'll just need you to be there honestly, with whatever that looks like on a Tuesday morning when nothing is polished and nothing is performed. You don't have to earn that kind of love. You just have to stay open long enough to recognize it when it arrives, and it will look nothing like intensity. It will look quietly like ease.